Welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to take a highly focused, really comprehensive look at a crisis that is fundamentally reshaping the United States. We're talking about homelessness. But we're not just skimming the surface here. We're going to examine it by looking closely at the hard data, the systemic drivers, and the distinct, everyday realities on the ground. Okay, let's dive into this. For generations, the promise of upward mobility, this deeply held idea that hard work guarantees a secure life, has really been the bedrock of the American dream. But I want us to reevaluate that promise today, especially in light of the mass displacement happening all across the country right now. As we look through our source material, we really have to ask ourselves, when thousands of educated, working, and highly vulnerable people are being pushed out onto the pavement, is that dream actually still attainable? Or is the system itself fundamentally breaking down? To wrap our heads around all of this, we'll start by looking at the scope of the crisis. Then, we'll travel to Philadelphia to examine the addiction trap, head over to Los Angeles to unpack housing financialization, and down to Tucson to see what it takes to survive the elements. Finally, we'll look at the invisible human toll and the pathways to stability. Section 1. The scope of the crisis, a nationwide emergency. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of what we're dealing with. When we look at the point-in-time figures captured between 2024 and 2026 across these three highly diverse cities, the numbers are just staggering. In Tucson, we see a population of 2,200 unhoused individuals. Over in Philadelphia, that number jumps to over 5,700. But then look at Los Angeles, a massive 195,000 individuals. That represents an alarming 35% surge. These numbers really force us to realize that this isn't some invisible tragedy confined to forgotten alleys anymore. It's a sprawling, escalating crisis affecting millions, both directly and indirectly. Section 2. Philadelphia, the addiction trap. In historic Philadelphia, particularly around the Kensington neighborhood, we're seeing the devastating, real-world effects of an open drug market. Basically, a highly visible public space totally dominated by the exchange and consumption of illegal substances. The source reports highlight Kensington as a notorious East Coast epicenter for these incredibly potent fentanyl and Xylazine mixtures. And for people who are already unhoused, proximity to this market creates an almost inescapable trap. The heavy sedation and extreme confusion caused by these substances pull vulnerable folks completely away from any sort of normal routine, practically locking them into a brutal day-to-day cycle of survival right there on the sidewalk. But addiction is really only part of the equation here. Housing is the foundation. A May 2025 analysis by the Housing Initiative at Penn reveals that Philadelphia is facing a severe shortage. We're talking 64,500 affordable housing units short. To put that economic pressure into perspective for a second, with average rents today, a minimum wage worker has to labor nearly 89 hours a week just to cover basic shelter. 89 hours! It's mathematically impossible. This structural shortage is literally pushing working individuals straight out of their homes and directly into vulnerable street conditions. And once you're on the street, systemic failures just drastically prolong the crisis. In Philly, reports note that 1,612 adults experiencing chronic homelessness desperately need integrated recovery services. But the barriers they face are severe. There's a massive lack of long-term rehab beds, brutal capacity constraints, and incredibly extended waiting periods. People are essentially forced to manage these incredibly complex needs entirely on their own, exposed to the elements, and often without even a fixed address to schedule a basic doctor's appointment. Moving to the West Coast? Section 3. Los Angeles, housing financialization. Los Angeles has basically become a modern tale of two cities. We are looking at a truly extreme visual dichotomy here. On one side, you've got insulated wealth, glittering opulence, tech billionaires, gated mansions. And literally just blocks away, you have makeshift tent cities, where an astonishing 59.9% of the massive unhoused population lives completely unsheltered right on the concrete. The divide between the ultra-wealthy and the desperately poor isn't just profound, it's highly visible. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the core driver of this displacement: aggressive corporate real estate buyouts across LA. Institutional investors are swooping in and buying up properties. And the result? Rent in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods has surged by up to 124%. Average home prices have been pushed to a staggering $1 million. The primary goal of these buyouts, as the sources explicitly note, is extracting maximum profit, which entirely, systematically removes the working poor and the shrinking middle class from the housing market.
So the crucial point here is how all of this creates what experts call a displacement doom loop. Let's look at the specific story of Mona, which was detailed in the source material. Mona wasn't someone you might typically picture. She was a highly educated data scientist with a master's degree. Her building was bought by a corporate holding company that immediately instituted a sudden, massive rent hike. Unable to pay that huge jump, Mona faced legal eviction. Living out of motels eventually caused her to lose her job. And without a home, she lost access to basic facilities, making it literally impossible to present well and interview for new positions. Almost overnight, an educated professional fell straight into chronic homelessness.
Section 4, Tucson, Surviving the Elements. Down in the Sonoran Desert, the environment acts as an active, daily threat. The housing shortage in Tucson is stark, a massive gap of 13,000 affordable rental units for low-income households. This pushes everyday, working individuals entirely out of the housing market and into informal encampments in river washes and underpasses. And when you're living outdoors in the desert, well, the sun itself becomes a major part of the crisis, turning the whole environment into an inescapable trap that just drains your physical resources every single day. The physical toll of this is absolutely brutal. The unhoused in Tucson must endure over 100 days a year, where temperatures sit above 100 degrees, often peaking way past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The result? Heavy fatigue, confusion, dizziness, and just relentless dehydration. Without a cool place to retreat to, survival becomes a daily, exhausting battle against an environment that never ever fully lets up. And the logistics of surviving this kind of heat, they're a nightmare, mostly due to completely overwhelmed infrastructure. On a given night in 2026, out of the 881 total shelter beds available in the community, 861 were already in use. The system is operating at near total capacity. Couple that with frequent sanitation cleanups that scatter people's minimal belongings and disrupt their informal camps, and you're leaving hundreds of people with absolutely no secure place to hide from the deadly heat. Section 5. The Invisible Human Toll. The tragic underlying reality of all this is that once you fall, the system practically seems designed to keep you down. Consider the anecdote of 55-year-old April Galva in Los Angeles. She spent 10 grueling years surviving in a tent before finally securing a subsidized apartment. But her relief was so temporary. Her building was purchased by a corporate developer, her rent was aggressively doubled, and she was legally rent-evicted right back onto the pavement. Once you fall, escaping the gravity of this system requires fighting practically insurmountable odds. I really want you to genuinely ask yourself this question to grasp the logistical impossibility of street life. How do you keep a laptop charged for a job interview when your only outlet is maybe at a public library? Where do you iron your clothes? What address goes on your background check? This invisible struggle burdens millions. That includes an estimated 839,700 undocumented individuals forming the absolute backbone of LA's economy who fear deportation if they report illegal rent hikes. And let's not forget the 30,000 homeless children in LA, quite literally doing their homework under streetlights. Section 6. Pathways to Stability. Let's move to and see how this builds into actual solutions, because actionable hope is definitely emerging. In Philadelphia, they're working hard to balance immediate emergency shelter with the long-term creation of integrated rehab and affordable units. In Los Angeles, grassroots legal defense groups are actively out there fighting evictions while pushing for major structural changes, like banning algorithmic price fixing by corporate landlords. And in Tucson, we're seeing incredible pilots like Star Village, a safe sleep site housing 25 residents at a time with on-site services, acting as a crucial stepping stone to permanent housing-first placements. Which brings us to our final thought for today. The source material from Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Tucson clearly shows us that homelessness is a deeply complex intersection of addiction, systemic housing financialization, and harsh environmental extremes. But, and this is crucial, it is a solvable crisis when met with the right strategies. So I'll leave you with this. What balance of immediate aid and actual systemic change is needed to rebuild our cities? Think about how your own community balances human dignity with civic policy. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.